In Davos, the World Economic Forum took place, bringing together politicians, oligarchs, multinational corporation leaders, and other power players from across the globe. One of the themes was improving the state of the world. Quite an ambitious agenda, don't you think? And given that Bitcoin fixes this, it's likely that Satoshi Nakamoto's invention was a hot topic in many of the meetings and conference sessions at the event. On a more serious note, what if the world's major economic and military powers realize that yes, Bitcoin is undeniably an amazing tool, and that this protocol would be far more effective than gold as an international means of settlement, as well as a foundation for the global monetary system? Just imagine the title of a World Economic Forum 2030 conference, Bitcoin, a technological revolution serving the free world. In this conference, Klaus Schwab, founder and still president of the forum, well into his 90s, would stand proudly on an enormous stage, delivering a highly solemn speech on all the potential benefits and advantages humanity could reap from this technology. He might even venture to quote Satoshi Nakamoto himself. "If you don't believe it or don't get it, I don't have time to try to convince you. Sorry." However, he'd make a key point clearer. Bitcoin cannot be used by just anyone or in any way. It's conceivable for Bitcoin to be used, for instance, by authoritarian regimes like Iran or North Korea, or any other country that don't fit within the Western orthodoxy. Bitcoin should not be used to launder money, finance terrorism, drugs, or any other illicit activity. Satoshi Nakamoto's invention is sensational for sure, but it needs to be tamed for the good of humanity. What would happen then? Would Bitcoin still retain its value in such a scenario? Or would this mean it's been drained of all substance and would inevitably wind up worthless, like some common fiat currency? Today, we'd like to discuss how, for example, the G7 nations might gain control of Bitcoin without killing it, but by using it according to the rules to their advantage. It all starts with the so-called 51% attack, also known as the Goldfinger attack. But before we go further, I believe it's important, as usual, to quickly revisit the concept of proof of work. This is one of the key technological foundations of Bitcoin. The proof of work synchronizes and secures the blockchain. Many people often mistakenly say that miners verify transactions. That's incorrect. Transactions are verified by all the nodes in the network. That is, anyone who has the Bitcoin Core software on their computer. It's a bit complicated to say exactly how many there are, since they're not all visible, but you can see on this BitNodes map that there are at least 14,000 Bitcoin nodes scattered all over the planet, even though the vast majority are located in Europe and North America. We'll circle back to this. When it comes to mining, the image of a puzzle is a great way to illustrate the interaction between miners and validators, which are the nodes. A puzzle takes some time to complete. You have to figure out where each piece fits for the full image to finally appear. However, verifying that the puzzle has been completed correctly is almost instant and requires very little effort. So, to summarize, miners solve the puzzle, the famous proof of work, and the nodes verify it. That being said, miners don't solve the puzzle by hand, but use specialized machines called ASICs, which can try several quintillions of combinations per second. For your information, a combination is called a hash, and the speed of these machines is therefore measured in hashes per second, or the hash rate. As soon as one of the miners finds the solutions, they're rewarded for their efforts with freshly minted Bitcoins, along with transaction fees. When we talk about Bitcoin network consumption, we're talking about the electrical power used by all these ASICs. And when we talk about the computational power of the Bitcoin network, we're talking about all the ASICs put together. Currently, this power is about 270 exahashes per second, which means that all the mining machines combined perform 270 quintillions of calculations per second on the Bitcoin network. This makes it the most powerful computational network on the planet by far. So now that we laid the groundwork, let's revisit the concept of a 51% attack. If an entity or group controls more than 50% of the network's power, which at the present time is approximately 135 exahashes, then they control block creation. This means that, statistically, they have a higher chance of solving the puzzle we talked about earlier, and thus hold an advantage over the rest of the network. It's crucial to clarify something very important before we proceed further. One of the biggest challenges for a decentralized network is to synchronize. That is, to reach consensus on the state of the blockchain. Where are we now? What's the latest block? Who made the transactions? Who owns what? And so on. It's been agreed that the chain seen as valid by the network's nodes is a chain with the most accumulated proof of work. In our puzzle analogy, it would be the chain containing the most complex puzzles. Many people still think that the valid chain is the longest one, or the one with the most blocks, but this is incorrect. The valid chain is the one that has accumulated the most work. This is also known as Nakamoto consensus. Having at least 51% of the computing power allows you to solve the puzzle more quickly than others, and therefore to theoretically create this chain with the most proof of work, and consequently to be regarded as the actual Bitcoin blockchain by default. That's not exactly correct. It merely gives you a statistical advantage, but it doesn't necessarily mean it will play out that way in reality. It's similar to the fact that if I had 2 dice and Guillaume had 1, and we said the first to roll a 6 wins, statistically, I should get there faster than him, but if he's lucky, he could roll a 6 on his first try. It's the same with miners. Having 51% of the mining power gives you an edge over the rest of the network to solve the puzzle before everyone else. Of course, as your share of the network increases, 60%, 70%, 80%, you have a better chance of genuinely taking control of the network. So what does it mean to take control of the network, practically speaking? Well, there are typically 3 things to consider: double spending, mining empty blocks, and censoring transactions. Today, we're going to put aside the first 2 and focus on the last one, censoring transactions. Remember, that's what Klaus Schwab wants to do by 2030 in our fictional scenario. Preventing certain people from using Bitcoin means, in practice, stopping their transactions from appearing in a valid Bitcoin blockchain block. Let's see how this works in practice. A transaction deemed dirty by some miners enters the mempool, which is the list of all pending transactions on the Bitcoin network. Typically, miners select transactions for their block based purely on economic criteria. The TX with the highest fees are selected. But in this case, certain miners decide not to include the dirty TX, even though it carries attractive fees. A race then begins between miners to solve the puzzle. We'll use colors to make the explanation easier to follow. Let's say Klaus Schwab's miners are blue, with at least 51%, and the rest of the network is red. As we've discussed, the blue miners have an advantage because they have at least 51% of the computational power. They should therefore solve the puzzle before the others. But things don't always go as planned, as we've seen. So there are many possible scenarios. The simplest one is where the blue miners find the solution first. Their block is added to the chain and the process starts again. All miners will now use this block as the most recently mined and build from there. All transactions included in this block are deemed valid. However, if the red team finds the next block first, the blues have 2 choices depending on the level of censorship they want to apply. The first option, they allow dirty transactions as long as they're not on their block. So in this case, they would continue to build on the latest red block. But this scenario is highly unlikely. If miners are focused to censor certain transactions, it's so that certain entities absolutely cannot use the network. Here, in the end, the bad guys would just have to wait for a red miner to find a block to include their transactions. It might take a little longer, but eventually it will happen. For your information, this is what happens today on Ethereum with OFAC and non-OFAC blocks. Anyway, the most likely scenario is that the blue miners ignore the last red block and continue solving their puzzle to propose an alternative block to the network. Now, you're probably wondering how this is possible, given that the red miners have already solved the puzzle. Well, this is where our analogy falls short. You'll have to take my word for it, but I encourage you to do your research for yourself. So let's continue. What we'll witness here is what's known as a fork. The chain splits. However, there's a very important detail not to overlook. The blue miners start with a delay, so they'll have to mine 2 blocks before the parallel chain mines a single one. As mentioned earlier, it's a race to have the most advanced block on your side and be considered the real Bitcoin chain. So it's generally a very risky strategy for dissenting miners. They might never catch up with the reds and thus waste time and energy on blocks that will be orphaned. Nevertheless, statistically, with 51% of the network's power, if you manage your resources reasonably well, you can consistently undermine the reds, which incentivizes the red miners to join the blue team economically. The more the blue team grows, the more control it gains. That's why with 51% maintained over a time and a little bit of fine-tuning, you can do it. Put it differently, the longer you can sustain your attack, the less likely it is to fail. In the dice example from earlier, Guillaume had a chance of beating me on a single roll. But if we roll the dice 1,000 times, I'm almost certain I'll roll more sixes than him. Well, that's the pure and hard theory. It's the famous Nakamoto consensus that I explained earlier. The valid blockchain is considered the one with the most work invested into it. That's the rule everyone agrees on for now. But understand this, you can very well change the rules. You'll simply be excluded from the network in question. For example, if I want to change the limit of the number of Bitcoin in circulation to 210 million, instead of, say, 21 million, who can stop me? No one. I would have just created a parallel chain with a different monetary policy, another token, and I hope that the miners will come to secure it. This is the story of pseudo-Bitcoin, like Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin SV, Dogecoin, and so on. If your brain is overheating a bit at this stage, it's normal. Personally, this is the question I struggled with the longest. But how do we know which is the real Bitcoin chain? It's very complex. It's a personal choice. For example, some people consider the Bitcoin Cash chain as the authentic blockchain, but it's also a spontaneous consensus among users, miners, developers, and all other actors in the ecosystem. As we've often repeated in our latest videos, Bitcoin is the anarchic project in the noblest sense of the term that works. Well, at least for now. But let's get back to our fork. We're not done yet. So even if the blue chain was behind, we could very well live with both networks in parallel. Let me explain here. We would therefore have a red chain with red miners and a red Bitcoin. On the other side, the blue chain with the blue miners and the blue Bitcoin. Now, if the Bitcoin that doesn't apply censorship is banned in a number of countries, there's a good chance that the world's largest exchanges won't allow its token to be listed, but they will have the blue Bitcoin. The price of the quote-unquote dirty Bitcoin will collapse, greatly weakening the red chain, which is secured, remember, by the distribution of red Bitcoins. The users of this chain could still try to economically encourage miners to secure this network by paying much higher fees, but it will still be very laborious given the power and resources at the other camp's disposal. And then, the more the chain incentivizes miners, the less the users are happy. To really end the debate and definitively finish off the dissident network, the blue miners could also attack the parallel chain to choke it off once and for all. For example, the blues delegate enough power to the red chain to mine blocks, empty. So no more TX gets through. And second cool effect, the blues collect the red Bitcoins as rewards. So the red miners have nothing. Either they migrate to the compliant blue Bitcoin or they go bankrupt. The red Bitcoin dies very quickly and the power returns to the blue Bitcoin. In short, in this extreme scenario, let's be very clear. The uncensorable Bitcoin may still exist, but it will have been marginalized to the extreme. A bit like the darknet today, the cypherpunk geeks will very probably find solutions to bypass the firewalls and to keep a version of the protocol on which any transaction can pass, but the mass Bitcoin will have been bridled. Moreover, keep in mind that it's not just a technical question. If our Schwab Bitcoin only censors North Koreans and a marginal fraction of the alleged terrorists without bothering the economic world on a daily basis, very few people will bother with a cypherpunk Bitcoin to gain privacy. Big tech companies like Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft have clearly shown that the vast majority of people don't seem to care much about preserving their privacy if they get handy features in return and a legal framework that ensures that they won't be bothered. This is not about whether you think this is good or bad. The point here is to understand how things work so you can adapt accordingly. Unless, of course, you're an activist championing for privacy rights, in which case, be aware of the formidable forces you're up against. Good luck. Now, the real question is it really possible for the US to amass 51% of the network's power? Absolutely. It's technically feasible. Let's take a look. Consider this, 270 exahashes EH. If you think about the containers filled with 350 S19 ASIC machines, each costing about $1 million fully equipped, that totals around $7 billion. Hence, half of the computational power available today can be estimated at about $3.5 billion. This isn't a staggering amount considering it only represents 0.3% of the American military budget. So even if you multiply the price by 10, because it's tricky to seize 51% of the hash rate, even if you're brute forcing it by buying everything and manufacturing what you lack, it's still entirely doable for the USA. However, there are a few technical challenges. The first one is purchasing these machines given that annual production only accounts for a fraction of the network's power. So it would be more cost-effective for the US to start manufacturing their own mining machines. It's definitely not impossible, but it would take a few years. Also, for such a decision to be made, the US would need to deeply understand the value of Bitcoin. We're still quite far from that point. The second hurdle is finding the electrical power to run these machines. Considering an S19 uses 3,000 watts, you'd need about 3.5 gigawatts, equivalent to the nuclear power station with 3 or 4 reactors dedicated solely to Bitcoin mining. Just to give you an idea, the financial cost of such an installation would be about $6 billion. Again, it's not impossible, but it would have to become a priority. So we're looking at between $10 billion and $40 billion for the whole operation by just throwing money at it. These estimates are totally achievable. Keep in mind that Bill Gates alone is worth $100 billion. Before we look at whether all of this would be profitable, could we optimize these numbers and, more importantly, how could we ensure that the hash rate from private investors worldwide would align with the US regulation without it needing to constantly compensate by purchasing new machines to maintain their 51%? This chart shows that since China's mining ban, the US has significantly increased its share to about 40% of the total hash rate. But be careful with these figures, as they can be skewed by factors we can't easily discern. For example, if a mining pool is located in the US, but it combines the hash rate of several miners worldwide, the hash rate will appear to be US-based, even though the computational power is elsewhere. But let's assume it's accurate. At a rough estimate, we can see that there's some ground to be gained without too much fuss. Suppose the US decided to offer a truly advantageous and stable status to miners on their soil, provided they comply with US regulations. In that case, you can bet they'd all be thrilled to pledge not to mine any naughty transactions. This would attract many foreign miners who would feel much safer with their headquarters in the US than in other countries like China or Kazakhstan. In this scenario, it would make sense for the US to give Bitcoin a status very close to legalizing its use in all aspects. I'm thinking particularly about tax exemptions on Bitcoin capital gains, for example. We might also envision Bitcoin being encouraged by banks, since the American government would have a control tool far more efficient than the dollar. In fact, Bitcoin could somewhat replace a potential digital dollar, or even better, a blockchain dollar could easily be built on Bitcoin. Provided they declare their wallets, Americans could have vastly improved payment facilities at a much lower cost than going through banks. This shift could also allow the US to lead the race in a new global leading banking and finance sector. The Chinese digital yuan would look like a joke in comparison, shelled before it even got a chance to establish itself. The issue of energy remains, though, which is a politically tricky problem. From this standpoint, the US could seek out extra capacities not only within their borders, but also in other countries through agreements. For instance, they could take on concessions for underused facilities like large dams in remote parts of the world where distribution networks have never been built for various reasons. Then, they let their miners exploit these sites. We can all agree that the US is pretty good at defending its interests, even in foreign territories. They could also mandate that any oil production facility using gas flaring must install mining equipment to use this gas. And the potential is massive. Roughly speaking, the electrical potential of gas flaring globally is around 400 terawatts, while Bitcoin consumes about 50 terawatts per year. Again, these are estimates, but given that the US currently produces about 15% of the world's oil, they could effortlessly harness about 60 terawatts from mining, which is more than enough to gain 51% of the network. Better yet, the US could offer free electricity to miners since oil companies pay fines for flaring today. In exchange for nearly free electricity and a made-in-the-US legal status, I have no doubt they would attract all the hash rate they needed. Additionally, this could even reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from oil production. What more could you ask for? So, in the end, the US could easily gain 51% of the hash rate without any expenditure, simply by attracting miners already in the field to their territory. Even worse, it would be tremendously profitable as miners would pay their income and capital gain taxes in the US. Attracting a new industry for $0 would certainly not harm the country's coffers. And all of this for the modest cost of drafting a few new laws. Ultimately, this would place them at the forefront of a new growth cycle, leading the race in modernizing economies with new crypto technologies, just as it was with the internet. There could be worse outcomes. Moving on to a question that's bothering some of you. Would this be a nightmare in terms of individual freedom? A nightmare? I'm not sure, but a regression for sure. The real question is, would this bother the majority of users? And I'm willing to bet not at all, especially if the price of this clean Bitcoin is rocketing to the moon. Today, everyone happily trusts their money with banks. Better yet, this could be sold as an advancement in individual freedom since you could have your own Bitcoin wallet, tax declared but independent from any private financial institution. In fact, this would be a step forward from today. Personally, I think the future crypto giants would even discourage you from managing your own wallet, much like what happened with the internet and the neutrality it initially offered. People want features far more than they want privacy. If you're a terrorist or an activist for a cause the US doesn't like, then yes, it's bad news. However, if you're advocating for freedom of speech in China or Iran, it could potentially turn to your advantage if the US decides to use you to achieve their goals. Basically, Bitcoin would become politicized, and gold would retain its interest at an international level for exchanges with, for example, Russia. In order for Bitcoin to be truly uncensorable in a world where everyone knows it has value, it will require that blocks of countries that do not get along, like Russia, China, and the West, compete to ensure that no one controls more than 51% of the hash rate, and that miners are spread around the world in vastly different geographical areas. This is exactly what we're trying to achieve with CleanSat mining through the tokenization of mining companies. On that subject, we're finally ready for the first phase of the project. The goal is to open 3 countries, Congo, Oman, and Paraguay, to install Bitcoin mining containers. The objective is to get the cheapest electricity with purchase contracts over long enough time horizons. And right now, the market has not been this favorable for a long time. A very low Bitcoin price and a very high hash rate are the ideal weather conditions to buy mining machines. We're opening doors to qualified investors, which, put simply, means if an investment of, attention here, this is in euros, 100,000 euros is not part of your diversification strategy, then you're probably not the right fit. However, this is assessed on a case-by-case basis. So if you'd like more information, please contact us at this address and we'll let you know if you qualify. Additionally, for legal reasons, we cannot accept US residents. Sorry guys. For everyone else though, don't worry, the proceedings are underway. Our goal is to be able to offer CleanSat mining for as little as 50 euros to anyone by the end of the summer. We're doing everything we can to make this happen. If we are starting with qualified investors though, it's because of regulatory reasons. Reaching private individuals requires many more permissions. Returning to the topic of this video, this realization, which may seem sad, isn't even surprising as it's the case with all new technologies. At the start, they constitute a very free space, either because the states don't care about them, because they're marginal, or because it takes time for the states to understand them. But eventually, they get assimilated into the global system. This has been the case with the internet, which has largely lost the absolute freedom and neutrality attributes it enjoyed in the 80s and 90s. This is a very interesting topic, and we're already preparing another video on this theme. For your information, in 2004, Richard Detent even did his master's research thesis on free software as a new trajectory for information systems. As one of the co-founders of this channel, Richard Detent was early on this one, to say the least. Except that 20 years later, open source software mainly concerns either the professional server market or hobbyists. In 2004, according to Richard, Windows was going to be eaten up by open source OSs like Ubuntu, and Apple had absolutely no future because its environment was too closed for users to renounce their digital freedom to such an extent. Visionary, I tell you. So from this point of view, and with this experience, if you think about it, keeping Bitcoin as it is and giving governance power to an international organization like the UN, G7, or whatever, could potentially be effective because it would ensure the network's longevity so that everyone, except the bad guys, of course, could use it. By organizing international consensus, like the US knows how to do, they could multiply their soft power compared to today while keeping the banner of multilateralism. Personally, if I were in their place, that's what I would do. But in that case, why bother with a proof-of-work crypto like Bitcoin rather than making a simple centralized proof-of-stake crypto? Or even a simple database? That's something very interesting to consider. The first thing is that if you have control of the biggest electrical power dedicated to the biggest hash rate power, you're not far from blocking the way for any competitor who would come with a new proof-of-work crypto. If the US takes over 51% of the hash rate, they can do two things and no more. First, kill a network by double spending or mining empty blocks. That's a bit foolish after so much effort. The second is to censor transactions by censoring blocks that contain dirty or naughty transactions. This means that the transaction history is preserved. In short, at the scale of a democracy, the power in place has the ability to carry out its policies, but not to go back in time. That's the great strength of proof of work. The more blocks pass, the more their immutability is reinforced. It's different in proof of stake, where the validating nodes can rewrite old blocks as soon as they agree to do it. In proof of work with Bitcoin, to go back in the past would require changing the Bitcoin code. To do this, you need a consensus on the network nodes, and if the US, in this case, would have the ability to publish proposals for changing the Bitcoin code, the risk of fragmenting the network between the happy ones and the unhappy ones would be too great. In and of itself, it would suffice that the major actors like states and banks decide to favor one chain over another, but this would damage the international protocol aspect that everyone shares. The goose that lays the golden eggs may not be killed, but certainly maimed. It would be a bit foolish though. Now, we still need to consider the flip side of the coin. The ability to censor transactions on Bitcoin could well be the start of a slow slide towards centralization of the network. In this new system, the weight of the miners in the network governance would be completely unbalanced. And then, of course, there's a risk that this government will unilaterally decide at some point to change other things in the technology. What do you think? Leave us your opinion in the comments. We are really interested in thinking together about this topic. In any case, no, Bitcoin is not inevitable. Bitcoin is not unstoppable. It's difficult, yes. Improbable, maybe, but clearly not impossible. Of course, the future is very uncertain and it's hard to predict how things will evolve. For example, the size of the market, the evolution of network power, the involvement of different states, citizens' awareness of their freedom, and so on and so forth. All are variables that will fundamentally influence how Bitcoin will be used in the future. But that's just life. We're condemned to live in uncertainty, and any school of thought that tells you that this or that is inevitable should be taken with a lot, and I mean a lot of caution, because it leads you into a wall. In this video, we took time to prepare with Guillaume. We painted one possible scenario, but the universe has this incredible ability to surprise us, and Bitcoin has so far always demonstrated its resilience and anti-fragility. So we'll see. In any case, we're not going to get bored.